And of course, we're in Isaiah today. Our background material is from chapters 7 through 12. Well, it's pretty hard to cover, 5 or 6 chapters at one go here. Our printed text comes specifically from chapter 7. But you remember last week, Isaiah, we studied about having a vision for the nation of Israel, nation of the Judah, the southern kingdom. And he saw a vision of God in the temple. Well, this week, Isaiah, God tells him to go to Ahaz, the king of Judah, which was 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and ask of God a sign. Now, the Ahaz was a wavering king, and we'll look at some background material here for the chapter 7 through 12 here. But and Isaiah goes to him to remind him of God's faithfulness, and offers then for him to ask a sign of God to confirm that. And the situation that was facing Ahaz, when Isaiah came on board as a prophet in 740 BC, it was the nation of Assyria. It was the dominant force politically and militarily in the Middle East. And they had taken smaller nations like the northern tribe, which was Israel. They had taken Aram, which we call Syria, and then even the southern tribe, Judah. And they had tried to make vassal states out of them, to where you basically paid tribute or blood money each year to keep them from attacking you, But you were servants of Assyria. Assyria was a extremely powerful force in the day of Isaiah. So what Ahaz is facing now is that the northern tribe, Israel, and Aram, which is Syria, they had formed an alliance and had decided to rebel against Assyria. They then went to Ahaz and told him that we want you to join our alliance, and we're going to rebel and revolt against Assyria. And if you don't do this, we're going to attack you. So Ahaz feels like he's in a no-win situation. If he doesn't join them, his 2 friends are going to attack him. If he does join them, he's going to have to fight against the Assyrians. And so he's in a pickle. And I mean, he's in a desperate situation. And so I want y'all to lay out, just kind of as we think through these things and we study these lessons, these basically are designed for us to put ourselves in that place, but also to remember when we have had no-win situations in our life where we're worried and we see that there's no way out and we don't know what to do. And this is what Ahaz was confronted there. But what we also to do, we want to look at this study to reflect upon the fact of how God has been faithful. He was faithful to Judah. He's faithful to you and I. And we want to reflect upon that. And, we want to individually think about what promises has God fulfilled for us. What answers, what are the big answers to prayer that we've had in life, and how has God come through with this, what has been his response. And I think when we look back upon it, we can reflect, and faithfully with what God has done for us. We used to have a service in our church, a Memorial Day service, and we would remember all of the servicemen and servicewomen who've been in our country, and who had served or who had lost their life, and it was a memorial day to remember them. But I would tell you that each of us needs to have a memorial day for God. We need to have benchmarks in our life when we think about challenges that we faced and what God has done to come and to address those challenges. If y'all would remember, when you think about what God would do sometimes in the Old Testament particularly, but I remember specifically when they crossed the Jordan River, what did he have them to do? He had them to carry one stone each from a tribe, and they made a monument on one side, He said as a memorial, of what God has done for you. So we need to have a pile of stones in our life that we can think back upon and think about what God has done to preserve and to foster us, over the years. Let me go ahead and recap kind of what's going on here. In chapter 7 through 12, it's about a theme about trusting in the Lord instead of trusting in human power. And we've already mentioned the situation that Isaiah was in and how powerful that Assyria was. And then that's in chapter 7, and we're going to look closely at that today. In chapter 8, Isaiah continued to prophesy about the rebellious coalition and their coming downfall. This would have been the northern tribe of Israel and Syria. He prophesied that they would cease to exist. In chapter 9, Isaiah returned to the theme of a future deliverer. He introduces this in chapter 7. He goes back to that theme in chapter 9. In the latter half of 9 and 10, Isaiah describes the steps that he's going to take, which are difficult, to get his people's attention and draw them back to him. And then in the latter part of 10, he delivers a message of judgment against Assyria. Even though God used him as an instrument, he also made them fall under his sovereign reign, and they were wicked, and they would be punished also. In chapter 11, Isaiah delivers another message now on the hope regarding the future deliverer or future Messiah. And in chapter 12 is just simply a song about praise and thanksgiving. So again, as you read through chapter 7 through 12, we think about trusting in the Lord. What does it mean to trust in the Lord? There are a lot of circumstances that come about in our life, and you wonder why was Ahaz in this position? He really had, difficult choices either way it went. But I want to tell you, I read recently, and I noticed on one of Jesus' preaching sermons that he was preaching on the Sea of Galilee, and it got late in the day, and day was winding down, and so he sends the disciples across the Sea of Galilee. He purposely tells them, cross over and I'll meet you on the other side. Well, we know this is the encounter where they had a storm and a high wind come up. And this is when they went to question, what's going on. And all of a sudden, in this storm, Peter sees Jesus walking across the water. And he takes Peter by the hand, and then we know the story. Peter started walking across, and then he sank, and he lifted him up by his hand, and it was an example of faith, But we have to think about, what was going on. Do you think that God knew there was going to be a storm when he sent them across that night? Absolutely. So what I'm telling y'all is this. Sometimes God puts us in the middle of storms. And we don't necessarily like that. We don't appreciate that. But it's there for our well-being. He had a real life lesson for Peter and those other 12 disciples in that particular case. And I know y'all read those verses many times. So when we look at these things like Ahaz here, we want to relate to how does it affect us personally. And your storm in your life is probably different than the storm in my life. But the outcome is the same. It's trusting God. And what he's trying to accomplish here is a deeper level of trust. Regardless of what happens out here, he wants us to know that he's in control and that he is managing the affairs of our life. And we can trust in him for that. And y'all know it takes a pretty thick rug sometimes to get on your knees and pray through that now. It's pretty hard. So, are there any thoughts up to now? Let's begin in verse 7 of chapter 7. And this is Isaiah's confrontation with Ahaz. He said, "This is what the Lord God says. It will not happen. It will not occur." In other words, this invasion of these two tribes that were north of Judah, he says, you're all worried about it. He says, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. King James says, "Thus saith the Lord." And, many times they introduce prophetic sayings and oracles in the Old Testament by saying, "This is what the Lord said," or "Thus saith the Lord," But it gave the prophet the privilege to say this: "I'm here on divine authority. These are not my thoughts and my ideas. This is what God said." And he used the phrase, "the Lord God." And the Hebrew word here for Lord is Adonai, and it means Lord. And then the second word, God, it's a Hebrew name meaning Yahweh. Usually in English Bibles, it's rendered as the Lord. So literally translated, the phrase that he mentions here, Lord God, it means Lord the Lord. And it emphasizes who he is. But by using this combined name, Isaiah stresses to King Ahaz that he could believe this prophetic message that he's bringing to him here. What was the message? Isaiah declared that this rebel coalition that intended on conquering Judah, and they were going to make Judah join them and rebel against Assyria. He says, it shall not happen. King James says, it will not stand. And Ahaz's situation might have looked bleak, but the Lord, he had a greater plan. So again, let's reflect back in our lives when it literally looks like there's no way out, But God has a bigger plan. And remember, God's plan where you and I, we're focused upon the physical world that we live in. We worry about our health. We worry about our businesses and our money. We worry about our relationships with other people. We worry about what's around us here. And those are all noble, wonderful things that God has granted to us. But remember, God's focus is upon the spiritual. He's looking for how are we going to spend eternity in the very best relationship with him that we can, And so this is a preparatory time for that. Consequently, he invokes upon us situations that develop us spiritually. We would have to think that God is not nearly concerned about the material side. Not that he's not concerned. But if he were concerned about the material side of our life, the physical side, let me say, then everybody would be rich and healthy and happy and everything would be perfect here, He would make it like that. But he doesn't do that. So we have to come back. What does he mean, when he wants to bless us, Deep thoughts there. So Ahaz had to choose now whether he's going to trust God or not. And he's either got to trust God or he's got to let his circumstances dictate, how his life is managed. And a really, really hard thing. I know most of the time I let circumstances get in the way of my faith, and I get to thinking, well, these things are overwhelming, I don't know what to do here. But just as in Isaiah's day and today, the life of faith, it includes living with this tension that we have between our circumstances and what God promises. And I tell you, it's tension there now. It's pressure. And we get it. We see it. And I remember what Paul said, he'd been in jail, he'd been beaten, he'd been shipwrecked. What did he say? He said, I've learned how to be comfortable in all circumstances, He was at peace. And he knew that whatever happened, that God was in control. But not many people get to the level that Paul got, to that degree there. And but it's real interesting. But I would say this. God calls us to believe His promises regardless of our circumstances. And that's a really hard, difficult thing to do here. Regardless of our circumstances, God is asking us to trust Him. And it's a hard thing. Are there any thoughts here? I think about what's going on in the world and the U.S. today. And this disease that's going around is changing everyday life for a lot of people. And we see jobs, businesses, families, restrictions, bad politics, mental issues that arise. I read in the paper today that people, people take advantage of children, abuse and stuff, that it's at record levels right now because the parents and adults are so stressed out, and they take it out on kids. But we're at epidemic levels of children suffering today because of what's going on out here. And so we see again this tension between what confronts us in daily life and what God's promises are. In verses 8 and 9, he tells him now what's fixing to happen. He said, the chief city of Aram, that's Assyria, is Damascus. The chief of Damascus is Rezin. And then in parentheses it says, within 65 years, Ephraim, which was the northern tribes, they will too be shattered to be a people. In other words, they're going to go away. So the chief city of Ephraim is Samaria, and the chief of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you do not stand firm in your faith, then you will not stand at all. So he tells him here two things. He says, these two nations that you're so fearful of, they're going to go away. He said it's not going to happen. And the second thing he tells me, if you don't align your faith with me, then you're going to go away too. You and all the nation here. And he's very explicit about it. So he prophesied that within 65 years, Ephraim would cease to be a people. That's the northern tribe. Well, I would tell you then that Damascus was conquered and Rezin was put to death 3 years after this prophecy. Then there was an invasion. This prophecy occurred around 735. In 732, Syria ceased to exist. The leaders were killed, they were overrun. In 722 then, there was a partial invasion of the northern tribe Israel. Their leaders, many of them taken away, a lot of people deported, and they continued to exist as a so-called vassal state for a while longer. That nation ceased to exist independently in 722. By the turn of the 6th century there, they ceased to exist altogether. They were gone. So Isaiah, he urges the king and the people of Judah to confirm in their hearts the certainty of God's promises. And if they chose to trust human power and threats rather than the Lord, their defeat was going to be certain. It's difficult for us to think about this, but when you have invading armies coming into your life, and I mean, it looks so ominous that you can't see past the next 10 minutes. How hard is it to put that aside and say, I have my faith in God? And that regardless of this, I can't see the outcome of this, but I'm going to trust it to God to make it right. And again, I just emphasize how hard it is for us, but also emphasize this is the step that God is trying to move us to. It's a faith in Him that moves beyond circumstances. And it's pretty easy for me to tell y'all how you ought to act and believe here. It's pretty hard for me to act for myself like that, you know. And it falls back on me. It's very hard to do that. Are there any thoughts?
One of the most comforting things that in the New Testament concerning that is when, for me it is anyway, when the man says to Jesus, help my unbelief.
Yeah.
When he says that, I don't know, somehow in my own prayers, I find myself being able to be honest about that all the time.
Yeah. That's a good verse. I believe, help my unbelief. Is that what he said or something?
I do believe, help my unbelief.
Yeah.
And that's just about where we are, you know.
Yeah.
We know what we're supposed to be thinking.
Yeah.
Somehow help us think it.
That's a good thought. In verse 10, he says, then the Lord spoke to Ahaz again. So this real short verse, it just emphasizes two important truths. First, it underscores the prophet's authority to speak. And it was as if God himself was speaking to Ahaz here. He said, I'm here on behalf of God. The second thing, it emphasizes God's merciful nature. Judah's circumstances, they look grim, but the king was given an opportunity to trust in the Lord and to stand firm on God's promises. So he gives him a chance, to work through this. In verse 11, this is the test. He says, ask for a sign from the Lord your God. It can be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. So the Lord invites Ahaz now. He says, enlist a sign for me. I want to confirm to you that what I'm telling you is true. You know, the Bible is full of signs. We saw Moses did signs with the 10 plagues of Egypt. I remember that God sent Eli's sign. He told him that he was going to judge his house because he had done a bad job of managing the priesthood. And the sign was not what he wanted. He says, both your sons are going to die the same day. And that was a sign to him. And we saw signs in the New Testament a lot. Signs were used to validate and to reinforce people's belief back at a time when everything about God was not known and when there were a lot of uncertainties about who Jesus was. But it was basically there so that believers could build a foundation of who God was. You know, today we have a written record of that. Consequently, I'm not dismissing miracles happening today, but we don't see signs. We had another king of Judah, Hezekiah, and the prophet came and told him, I can't remember which prophet, but he says that God has required that you die. And Hezekiah said, prayed before the Lord. And the prophet told him, he says, because of your prayer, he has extended to you 15 more years of life. And Hezekiah wouldn't believe him. He said, I need a sign. He asked for a sign. And he says, the shadow on the steps will go backward, either up or down the steps, today to show you that God heard your prayer and He's answered your prayer. And they documented that. And he lived 15 more years, you know. And so we see that this wasn't unique what he offered Ahaz here. But Ahaz declined. And I look at this when he says that there were no limits on what the sign he asked for. He didn't ask for a simple thing. He said, as deep as Sheol, which was as deep as death, you know, that was as deep as you could get, or as high as heaven. So the two extremes of what they knew, the high and the low of anything that they could relate to, he asked them to. He says, anything between heaven and hell, he says, I grant to you. He said, just call a sign and I'll do it. And look at Ahaz's response in verse 12. Ahaz replied, I will not ask, I will not test the Lord. So he rejected God's offer, and he said, I will not test the Lord. It reflects then that what was really going on here, Ahaz is trying to whitewash over the fact he's claiming false piety here. I'm not going to test the Lord. But he had already decided not to believe and have faith in what the prophet had to say. If you go over and incidentally, ironically, by him choosing, he says not to test the Lord, that's exactly what he did. But if you go back and look in 2 Kings in chapter 16, Ahaz has already made an alliance with the king of Assyria. He has paid tribute to him. He took the articles of gold out of the temple. He gave them to the king of Assyria. His name was Tiglath-Pileser. Name that I can't say or pronounce, you know, spell it or anything. Not only that, he goes to Assyria. He makes a replica and a design of their pagan god, and he brings it back and he puts it in the temple in Judah for people to worship there. And so he agreed to be a vassal state. He wanted protection from Aram and the northern tribes of Israel. And the guy from Assyria, he does this, you know. And but he compromised all of his worship. So we see here that when he tells Isaiah, I don't want to test the Lord, he's lying. He's already got a deal working with the Assyrians already. Any thoughts here? Look in 13. Isaiah says, listen, house of David, is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of my God? So he confronts Ahaz about his unbelief, about this false humility. And he talks about, he mentions here the house of David, so the entire tribe of Judah. And he emphasizes here that the whole nation is going to be affected. When he says house of David, he means the tribe of Judah here. He says, try the patience here. King James says weary. So clearly Isaiah has reached a point of extreme frustration now with Ahaz. And the king, he could dismiss Isaiah, you know, as just being a prophet that's in the way and saying some things I don't like. But he's not going to be able to dismiss the sovereign directive of God himself. And those tactics are not going to work. I would tell you all this. And for Ahaz's situation, trying the patience of God is way more dangerous to us than threats of outside influences, whatever they are in our life out here. And we always want to remember that. A lot of Bible scholars look in verse 13 and they notice something. You look back in verse 11, and in verse 11, Isaiah spoke to Ahaz, and he says, the Lord your God. Well, now, we're to this frustration level. And look what he says in 13. Will you also try the patience of my God? So now we see a shift in how Isaiah perceives Ahaz. He realizes now that Ahaz does not belong to God. And Ahaz has no faith in God. And so his language is different now then. In 14, he says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. So Isaiah exposed King Ahaz's unbelief. The king didn't want to hear about God's plan. He already had this scheme on his own that I described to y'all. And however, Ahaz's refusal to ask for a sign, it's not going to hinder God. His sovereign plan is going to unfold. It's not going to affect God in the least. Isaiah declared that the Lord himself would give Ahaz and the people of Judah a sign of his choosing. So we see now, because Ahaz didn't choose a sign, God says, I'm going to give you a sign. And we think about it. God is sovereign. We talked about that last week. God's eternal plan is unfolding. Periodically, God gives you and I an opportunity to be a part of that plan. And, step by step. And we can choose to or not. But it doesn't change the plan. If you choose not to, just as he did here, God has an alternative plan. And I've kind of looked at it in my mind, how I try to fashion this. God here, he has a reason, but way down here, he has an outcome. And that outcome is set. So we see up here, it's almost like little fingers of water running down the wall. And we're those fingers. If we choose to be part of that, then that is directed through us. But if we choose not to, God's sovereign will is directed through another little trickle of water over here. But guess what? The water always gets to the bottom, and it always ends up in the spot that God wanted it to be. And so in my mind's eye, that's how I look at all these contingencies in life with millions of people, and God has got a set plan. And we see little trickles of water running down like a concrete wall. We know that ultimately they're going to get to the bottom. It just depends on, do you want God's will to trickle through you or not? That's really what it boils down to. So, an interesting thing, isn't it? He says then in this, Isaiah announced God's sign, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. Bible scholars have debated in which way God fulfilled this sign. There's an initial view that we know that this is in Jesus Christ through the virgin birth of Mary. There was also a second thought here, that during Isaiah's time, and it's not exactly the same kind as prophesied in Isaiah later on, but there was another birth, and a woman in Isaiah's name, she would have been a virgin, and she was married and announced the birth of a child, and they named the child Emmanuel. A lot of people, they think that this was fulfilled in Isaiah's day. He had a second wife. In chapter 8, it talks about a prophetess, his wife. She had an ability to prophesy too. And it said we'll name the child Emmanuel. So a lot of people think that child is the one that was a sign, that all these things would change. Emmanuel means God with us. And if they trusted in the Lord and not in Assyria, they would find that they had no reason to fear the northern tribe of Israel or Syria. And so literally we think about Jesus Christ and what he did through this. Christ literally became God with us. And that's how we get to this. So we have a prophecy that most likely was fulfilled in Isaiah's time. But simply it would have been a young girl that was married, and ultimately she has a child named Emmanuel, and before that child is of age, we'll look at the next verse here. Look what he says. By the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating curds and honey. So Isaiah explains the historical significance of the child's birth. What he's saying here is, what I'm telling you today, it's going to become clear in a matter of just a few years. It's fixing to happen before this child can be born and be, near an adult. Before it says he can discern what's right and wrong. He talks about eating curds and honey. There's a lot of different, sometime in the Bible we think about curds and honey as being a time of prosperity, but this is a time of desolation. This indicates then that curds and honey were foods that nomadic people ate because they're having to pack up and move, and curds were made as a milk product. I kind of think it's almost like cottage cheese is what I'm reminded of, or something like that. But these were foods that were transportable. They could milk their goats or whatever, and daily they would have curds, and they could harvest honey as it went along the way. So we see here, rather than a stable society of city-states and stuff that Judah faces today, or that's where their environment was, they're going to be a people on the move again, eating curds and honey. In 16, he said, before the boy knows to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned. So this is essentially a repeat of verse 15. But in 15, the prophet's conclusion concerned about what the child's diet would be. He talks about just everyday circumstances in verse 15. But in 16, Isaiah's conclusion, he focused upon this real-time threat that Judah faced from the Syria-Israeli coalition. Before the child becomes of age, the two kings threatening Judah would be abandoned. King James says will be forsaken. So, again, we spoke about this earlier. Isaiah's prophetic words proved true. 735 for the Syrians, 722 for the northern tribe of Israel. And then he says in 17, the Lord will bring on you your people and your father's house. Look on that. On you, your people, and your father's house. Such a time as has never been since Ephraim separated from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. So he emphasizes here that he's going to use Assyria as an instrument of judgment. And the phrase rendered you, your people, your father's house. It emphasized just the thoroughness of God's judgment. It's going to impact everybody. It's going to be you, the people, and your father's house, all your ancestors here. They're going to be impacted by this. And Ahaz's unbelief and his foolish decisions, it's going to have dire consequences for all the people of Judah. And we think about this. You say, well, what is God saying here? Ahaz made a horrible decision to not choose God. So now everybody in the country suffers. Well, let me say this. There is suffering in the world, but he points out this. Leadership in a country, like a king, or like in our case, a president, or high officials, governors, judges, they have influence over how the rest of society thinks, acts, and responds out here. And we know generally that that people they look at their leaders and they mimic their leaders in what they do. And over time, we see that many leaders in our nation have become less and less focused about God and more about what a worldview has about how it ought to be. We look at abortion. We look at sexual issues today with, men professing to be women, and, it's so many weird things. And so what he's saying is this, that Ahaz's unbelief, it's going to have unintended consequences down the road for the people. Today, I tell you that the same is true today. Our leaders help determine the culture, the philosophy, the religion of our nation going forward, and they shape that. And y'all see today, we've got an election coming up for president. We've got governors being elected. Yesterday, we had a nomination for a Supreme Court justice, and these decisions, they have far-reaching effects. The Supreme Court justices and judges across the nation, they may have a more lasting impact upon society than even the president could, because they interpret all the laws that the land passes. So he says in this verse, I'm going to bring on you, your people, and your father's house. Such a time has never been since Ephraim separated from Judah. We remember when we started off with 12 tribes, but right out of the gate, 100 years into that hierarchy there, 10 northern tribes, they split off. And, we had Saul, then we had David, and we had Solomon. Under Solomon's son, Rehoboam, 10 northern tribes split. And he tells him, he says, you're not going to see chaos in the land as much as, and you have to reflect back upon that time to see the extent of chaos that's going to be in the land when this happens here. So he said that he will bring the king of Assyria. If you go back in Kings and read in, I think in chapter 16 of 2 Kings, he says, I will summon the fly from Egypt. He said, I will call for the bee out of Assyria, and I will summon them, and he says, and they will swarm the trees and the bushes of Judah. God puts it in such a descriptive manner. It's just like he called, a horde of insects in on it, and that's what it's going to be like and we see. So this session, it's focused upon the theme that since God is sovereign, his people can trust in his promises. And I just would ask today that God give us the grace to trust his promises, and for this is what allows our faith to grow in him. Are there any thoughts as we wrap up today?
I think that it was encouraging that we had a prayer walk in Washington.
That was yesterday. Yeah.
That was really encouraging.
Yeah. Franklin Graham had a prayer walk from the Lincoln Memorial all the way to through the National Mall. They stopped along the way. Different people prayed, for our nation here. So they had about 10,000 volunteers that had came to Washington, D.C. to join Franklin Graham to make this small march and walk and pray yesterday.
The new selection for...
Pardon?
The new selection for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
She's got a tough road ahead of her.
She does.
They're already attacking her about her number of kids, her religious beliefs, just name it. They're blowing the money.
Yeah. Well, an interesting time, but, she doesn't believe in abortion, and she believes in the Constitution, and so we'll see how it settles out. So I'm going to say for most evangelicals, she's pretty consistent, how they would believe. Johnny, would you dismiss us today, please? Would you dismiss us, please?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Dismiss as a prayer. Dismiss as a prayer.
No.
Pray for the thing. Dismiss as a prayer.
Oh, you want me to pray?
Yeah.
All right. Father, we thank you for all that you've done for us and all you've given us. We thank you for your word, Lord. Just help us to hold it in our hearts and our minds and follow you in all that we do. Father, we ask that you watch over this nation. Give us good leaders, Lord. Give us Christian people. Help us to be obedient